Hello again. I'm Professor Peter Jonason, your stylish scientist. Today, why don't you join me on some red wine, and we'll talk about mate preferences. You remember from my other videos, I have been trying to advance the case that there are really only 5 higher order things that people want in their romantic and their sexual partners. There's also little esoteric minutiae, but in the large picture, the things that we really need are expressions of the problems we've faced over our development and over our evolution as a species to solve some of the fundamental problems that we are faced with. So the first one, the obvious one, is things like physicality, physical attractiveness. This has to do simultaneously with species recognition, but also the sufficient arousal to engage in sex, right? Without that, you're just friends, right? We have compassion as another one, right? Being kind. Well, within relationships, there are often a lot of dangers, and having a person who's kind will protect you from those dangers that are rather recurrent over generations and evolution. Number 3, I call it competence, status, access to resources, things like that. And these first 3 are actually called the big 3 in most mate preference research. And usually the way in which we work out these big 3 is from throwing a whole bunch of random-ish indicators into sophisticated analyses called factor analyses, and we seem to reduce down to fairly reliably 3 more or less higher order factors. I don't think that's enough, though, because there's a lot of problems with this approach, one of which is that it's bottom up. If we take a top-down approach, there's at least 2 other things that haven't really been well considered in the mate preference game: compatibility and character. A compatible partner is someone you want in the long term, right? A compatible partner is someone you get along with better, who's going to make a better teammate, a better partner. Someone who has better character, trustworthy, reliable. Okay? And so based on evolutionary psychology, sexual strategies theory, for example, we would expect sex differences in qualities like physicality more than we would in qualities like character and compatibility, because the physicality is more about the initial attraction, and it often feeds into short-term mating interests, whereas the other 2, while they might be relevant in short-term mating interests, they're really things that men and women agree on. And so where you find the greatest number or greatest magnitude of sex differences should be where men and women have faced the greatest amount of sexual conflict. So they face more conflicts in the short-term casual sex domain, because women are always obligated to their offspring, but males aren't, and they haven't been ancestrally. Whereas because men can have casual sex and kind of move on, their preferences seem to shift more in response to this contextual variable. But usually the contextual variable that's only being considered is the long-term, short-term, which is not really a contextual variable if we're honest, right? It's really more of like a relative relationship duration variable. And so we want to try to understand how different contexts might influence not just what people want, but the sex differences therein. As you know, I have this data from Australia and from Turkey. And so what I'm going to report for you here is some of the data that we have from this. Now, there's lots of findings that we have. I spent some time today just pulling out some of the interesting things for you. Remember, this is a sample of about 450 people from Australia and Turkey. We have about only 120 men, but it's not the end of the world here. And we asked them to choose which trait matters more to them. All those traits that I mentioned, right? Physicality, compassion, right? So I just pose you the question. Consider a short-term relationship. Which matters more to you? The physicality features of the person or the compatibility features of that person? And you choose, right? And then we count up the number of times you chose each of those things in each of those domains, and it gives us a count of how much you want that thing, how much you chose that thing, right? So the first bit we'll start with is the easy bit, right? We'll start with the classic Buss and Schmidt 1993 sexual strategies theory findings with the addition of compatibility and character, okay? So here's the first figure I want you to look at. So what we see is on the top, you see short-term mating interests, and on the bottom you see long-term or short-term mating context, long-term mating context. These are sex differences in each of the qualities. You see in the short term, you see sex differences where men choose physicality more than women do, as would be expected. Yeah. But in contrast, you see women choosing compassion more than men do. Well, why might this be the case? Why might women want a casual sex partner who's compassionate? Well, because women are exposed to greater risk. So having someone who's a guy who's nice might be a preventative measure from that risk. There's a slight difference here as well with competence, suggesting that women want their partners more than men want their casual sex partners to have access to resources, to have social status, but this effect actually isn't very large statistically. It is significant, but it's not something that's worth writing home about all that much. And then we add on the right here, look, there's no sex difference in compatibility. Both partners want someone who they vibe with for casual sex, right? That's what it suggests, and they want that thing equally. Women also want a long-term partner who they feel has character, which might again have to go back to this issue of the risk that women are faced with when engaging in sex, because the guy could, as the saying goes, hit it and quit it, okay? Now, moving down to the long-term mate preferences, this is where sexual strategies theory would predict there would be fewer. And you notice here there are 50% fewer sex differences than in the long term than in the short term. Men, of course, continue to maintain their interest in physical features, but notice it's really small, right? So both men and women really prioritize other things in their long-term partners, but men continue to maintain at least the shred of greater interest in the physicality of their partners than women do. But nothing else is going on. Both men and women want a compassionate long-term partner, right? A toxic relationship in the long term affects both men and women. A partner who's incompatible, both sexes agree, right? We want someone who is like us. Remember, sexual strategies theory predicts fewer sex differences. In particular, it predicts it in the traits that are long-term focused, like compassion, like compatibility, and like character. In competence, however, we now find a slightly larger sex difference than we did in the short term, suggesting that while women tend to dispositionally want a partner who has more competence, social status, resources, that type of thing, it's particularly pronounced in the long term. And this relates to a paper we did in 2012 where we were able to isolate this preference for, in our case, was social status and income, which is basically just competence, but with very particular items. This is where competence matters, because it's hard to extract resources from a guy who you're not going to be with very long. But if you're going to be with that guy a long time, he needs to have the resources to keep it going, right? To keep the relationship going. You may have some more wine here. So that's pretty obvious stuff, right? I think that really confirms much of what we already believe about life, about people's mate preferences. But let's move on to the country stuff, because that's not as well established. Now, lots of studies on countries, I'll show you it here, focus on, for example, large-scale studies with 150 countries or 39 countries or things like that. But all that allows you to do is correlate the country-level features with the country-level mate preferences. But what I'm more interested in is understanding this idea of local calibration. So how do people who live in these two places that differ in many, many ways, how do they calibrate their mate preferences in response to the conditions in their local environment? Okay? So what you see in the top here, we have, again, short-term mating and in the bottom we have long-term mating. We see in neither the short-term and the long-term mating, there is no difference by country in physicality, right? So it suggests that the physicality preferences are really calibrated solely, at least in our data, solely on the sex of the person. Still, you see very, very low level interest in it, as you'd expect, right? Moving over to compassion, you see in both cases, long-term and short-term, that people in Australia care more about compassion than Turkish people, but that effect is larger in the short-term context than the long-term. And that might have a little bit to do with the kind of relatively casual sex, promiscuous culture that Australia has, the more free love kind of culture that Australia has relative to compassion, as in more people have to choose it there because it is a potential risk for them there. Moving over to competence, you see competence is only important to Turkish people in the short term. The idea would be the reason that people in Turkey might engage in casual sex is because they perceive their partners to have social status. It might get them somewhere. No effect here in the long-term context. Moving over to compatibility and character, you see effects that are more or less uniform but significant in both cases, right? So the qualities that are going to likely lead to like long-term mating success, Turkish people want more than Australian people. Again, this might have to do with the fact that Turkish people are maybe more likely to engage in long-term relationship and more traditional values when it comes to sex. It could also be in terms of, I said that one wrong. Compatibility, you see greater preference in Turkey, whereas in character, you see greater preference in Australia for character. So there's this kind of flip-flop we have going on here. And so in the compatibility one, well, it might be really important to have a compatible partner in a more dangerous place because there's more challenges to face. But character might be more important for Australians because maybe their safety needs are met. And so now what they have to worry about is like, is this a good person that I can trust, as opposed to, am I going to form a team with this person, which is what I think compatibility is really about, okay? Now the results just keep getting more and more complicated, and so I can't give you all of the results. I'm going to give you 5 more bits of results, and it's for each of the 5 traits. Here's the first one, okay? So what you see here are the preferences for physicality. Okay? And in the preference for physicality, guess what? You see no difference in the magnitude of the sex differences as a function of both countries, right? It suggests that physicality preferences, men want an attractive partner more than women do, basically at the same level, whether they live in Australia or whether they live in Turkey. And this probably makes sense if you understand the evolutionary psychology around why men seek attractive partners. It has a lot to do with fertility and fecundity and these types of things. Okay? To the next one, you'll see compassion. So in compassion preferences, you see no effect in Australia, no sex difference in Australia. So what's going on here? Well, in this case, people might equally care about how nice someone is in a place that is also quote unquote nicer, right? So they both value the compassion of a person in this place that's nice. In contrast, it's women who have to up their interest when they're in Turkey, and men decrease their interest in compassion because they've had to allocate their points elsewhere, for example. Right? So Turkish women, relative to Turkish men, value compassion, but there is no sex difference in Australia on this mate preference for compassion. The next one is competence. I'll show it to you here. As you see here in competence, now we have the opposite that we had with compassion. We see no sex difference in Turkey, but we see a rather substantial sex difference in Australia, suggesting that Australian men are allocating the thing they value elsewhere. Maybe they allocated it to compassion, for example, because Australia is a place that is so well protected for men and women that maybe they don't think they need to provide as much, right? Maybe they can say, oh, I don't really need a competent partner so much. In contrast, what you can also see from this is that the difference really that's happening is it's Australian men are devaluing competence in a context that's nice, but Australian women pretty much have the same value that they're placing on competence as Turkish women. So the real action here is just simply in this one subgroup of Australian men devaluing, right, decreasing the amount of times they chose competence because, again, they're putting this elsewhere. Where they're putting it is for analyses another day. Fourth, we have the compatibility factor, right? So this is one of the new ones that I'm trying to add to the larger puzzle of mate preferences, right? There's not a lot of research on compatibility, so this is rather new. But what do you see here? Well, you see something of a crossover interaction. You see that men, regardless of their place, Australia or Turkey, they place, a fairly medium level interest, but they're equivalent interests. What you get here is a slight effect where Turkish women increase how much they want someone is compatible, and Australian women decrease slightly how much they want someone who is compatible. And so not a particularly strong called interaction here, but it's there, and you can see the pattern, I hope. Lastly, character. And you see here, character, very minimal sex differences here. Indeed, the one with compatibility might be kind of a statistical kind of fluke, right? Because we expect fewer sex differences and weaker sex differences in the context and therefore also in the qualities that people want for their long-term partners. People agree, right, that these are the things that matter in serious relationships. And some of those people that can agree are men and women. And you see that even more pronounced here with character, where there's just no sex differences. And indeed, not only that, are there no sex differences, there are apparently no country differences either, right? So men and women from both countries basically value character at the same level. And it suggests that, character and compatibility might be really essential ingredients for people's mate preferences and therefore their mate choices, but they've been neglected quite a bit in research. Somebody might have included an item about trustworthiness, but it ends up loading into this factor for warmth or compassion, as I like to call it. And so what we need to do is spend more time delving the depths of what it means to be compatible, because remember, that's really where the action is, right? If you find partners you start your pool with compatible, good people of character, people who you're compatible with, and you choose from them someone who you find attractive, the game is basically over. You found a great partner. But dating apps like Tinder and Bumble, they have us going in the opposite direction, right? They have us selecting an initial pool based on looks, which is basically a quality that's valued primarily in the short-term context. And then guess what? You have a pool created by people who you're probably not compatible with. And then the relationship ends, no surprise, you get burned and you keep getting burned, but more importantly for Tinder, you keep coming on the app and you keep paying for their services. So, my only advice to you as I leave is seek partners first who are compatible. Create pools of people, create groups of people when you go to things, when you meet people. Ask your friends to introduce you to people. Compatibility is the thing you should start with. Character is the thing that you should start with. Physicality, beauty is everywhere, and you'll find it. All right? Thanks for your time. Like, share, comment. Ciao.